Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We're very excited to be back in person. This is the first in-person event that ICE has hosted since the pandemic, so very exciting for us. My name's Judy Morgan, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. But before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that the space we're meeting in today is on lands covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, and Wendat people. Today, in modern day, Toronto is still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also wish to acknowledge that while I am not a person of African descent, I am committed to continually acting in support of and in solidarity with Black communities, seeking freedom and reparative justice in light of the history and ongoing legacy of slavery that continues to impact Black communities in Canada. As part of this commitment, I would also like to acknowledge that not all people came to these lands as migrants and settlers. Specifically, I wish to acknowledge that those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. And I pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. Who I am is the chair of the Intergovernmental Committee for Economic and Labor Force Development, which we call ICE for short for obvious reasons. In a nutshell, ICE facilitates collaboration among all three orders of government around economic and labor force development in Toronto. And our goal is to break down the silos and to facilitate information sharing and collaboration across government. Our members include representatives from about a dozen different offices at the City of Toronto, Province of Ontario, and the federal government. Our activities are made possible by the financial support of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada and the City of Toronto's Economic Development and Culture Division. And our activities include identifying topics of collective interest, around which we commission nonpartisan third-party research and host forums such as today's event. Before I start the program formally, I just want to, if you miss them, the location of the washrooms is sort of out these doors and down the stairs again, and turn right, I think it is, and you'll see the signs. And the fire exits, I think, are out that way as well. And the last little bit of non-conference business is I just want to bring to your attention this piece of paper, which you'll find on your chairs. And this is an evaluation form that we would really appreciate you taking a few minutes to fill it out. You can either leave it behind when you leave the session, or if you prefer, you can fill it out online by using the QR code. So why we're here today. Today's program is a great example of the collaborative power of ICE. The research project was commissioned by Adrienne Leakey, who I'm not seeing here today yet, but I know she's planning on coming. And she's our member from the Ontario Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. And then our member Shirley Hudson-Hill from Toronto Economic Development and Culture Division led putting together today's program and the logistics and all of that stuff that to make today's event such a success. In terms of the program agenda, we're going to begin by asking Drs. Braille and Finaldre to celebrate the results of their research, and this will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Maddie Simetiki. I didn't get a chance to practice your name before you. And then it will be up to your turn to ask questions. In advance, I just want to thank all our speakers, moderator, and panelists for the generous donation of their time and ideas and being with us today. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to introduce Maddie, and then I'm going to turn the rest of the program over to him. Maddie is a professor of geography and planning and is the director of the Infrastructure Institute at the University of Toronto. His work focuses on delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, evidence-based infrastructure investment decisions, and the effective integration of infrastructure into cities. His recent studies explore transit policy decisions, the value for money of P3 projects, the development of innovative mixed-use buildings as a form of place-based infrastructure policy, and the diversity gap in infrastructure industry workforce. So all very important topics that remote work has sort of a tangential impact on, but yeah, it's all about where people decide to commute or not to commute. So over to you, Maddie.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of Toronto. I'm Maddie Simiatiki. It is a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon for this conversation, both to launch this exciting study on remote work and whether it's an urban panacea or a curse, and also then to have a conversation about where we're at and where we might be going. So as was mentioned, we're going to start out with Professors Shauna Braille and Tara Vinodre presenting the report, and then I'll turn it over to a number of panelists to say a few words from their perspectives, and then we'll have a bit of a facilitated discussion, and I'll ultimately turn it over to all of you who I'm sure have burning questions. And we are really in a moment of burning questions about where remote work is going. Before we start, just out of curiosity, how many people would say that they work in an office primarily? Okay. How many people would say they go to a workplace primarily? Okay. How many people would say that they are exclusively remote work? And how many people would say they're a bit of a half and half? Okay. So you're getting the sense. I'm probably, speaking for myself, I'm probably in the half and half to 2/3 remote. Universities are a bit of a unique employer, depending on whether it's during the school term or not. But the timing of this conversation couldn't be more important. You're starting to see really coming out of the pandemic, you're starting to see really the exercising of different policies and points of tension. So just to frame this up a little bit, Amazon, for example, has now announced that they're calling back their office workers to the office 5 days a week. The federal government is making announcements and proclamations that they're going to start ramping up how many days a week they expect their employees to be in the office. And this is, amongst other employers, this is leading to conversations about what are the work-related implications of work from home, but also what are the broader societal implications on employees, on issues of diversity and inclusion and possibly exclusion, and ultimately then on cities as well, and how cities function and what it could mean for our transportation systems, our real estate, and many other dynamics. So these are the points of tension and conversation that we're going to get into today. And to kick us off then, I'm going to turn it over to Tara and Professor Shauna Braille, Professor Tara Vinodre and Professor Shauna Braille. Both Tara and Shauna are professors in the Institute for Management and Innovation. Shauna Braille is Associate Professor and Director of the Institute for Management and Innovation at University of Toronto and holds a cross appointment at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Professor Tara Vinodre is Professor in the Institute for Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto, where she directs the Master of Urban Innovation program. So these are two people who are really well positioned to be giving us a foundational report about remote work and its future. So without further ado, I will turn it over to them to get us started. The floor is yours.
All right. So first of all, thank you. Thank you very much to ICE for funding and supporting this research project, which we actually completed in March. And so that was 6 months ago. And it turns out, Professor Braille and I were talking this morning, that a lot has actually happened in the last 6 months that sort of accelerate some of our thinking and thoughts around these issues. It's not a done deal in terms of where the city sits and where we sit on remote and hybrid work. So again, it's a work in progress, even though we are completed our study. What I want to do today is sort of what we both want to do today is sort of give you a high-level overview of the work that we did to understand better the sort of the dynamics of remote work and its implications for cities and the built environment. And we were given 5 research questions, which I would not do to any of my students. But they gave us 5, and they were all big questions. They were, what are the implications of remote and hybrid work for equity? What are the implications of remote and hybrid work for productivity? And then thinking about not just what that means for the labor force, but what does it mean for cities themselves and the built environment? And is there a possibility that we can repurpose or reimagine our cities, including the buildings in them, which represent an enormous amount of embedded concrete and things like that? Can we imagine them in a different way? And what are the best practices and what kinds of policies or recommendations can we make specifically for Toronto and the Toronto region in thinking about these things? And we want it to be evidence-based. I mean, everyone has an anecdote about their friend next door or, who works remotely, or who has an employer who's requiring them to come back to the office, or, an impact it might have on someone that they know well. But we want it to be much more systematic and move beyond anecdote to really systematically evaluate the existing evidence on the dynamics of remote work and its implications for the urban environment. And so to do that, we're going to work through, this is sort of an outline of what we're going to speak about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the implications are for the labor force, then I will turn it over to Professor Braille to talk about the implications for the vibrancy of our built environments in cities, with a specific focus on Toronto itself. But really, before we get started, we have to think a little bit about what we mean by remote work itself. We can sometimes think about remote work as stuff that happens far, far away in some other country, potentially. And I even think about that when we talk about digital nomads, the people who have chosen to exit and maybe live in a really warm place where they can go and enjoy the beach, and then they go back to their computer and work for a little bit. Or we can also think about it, people who are working in co-working spaces, who aren't working from home all the time. But what we were really thinking about when we started our study, most obviously because of the impacts of the pandemic, were people who suddenly found themselves working from home, sometimes for the first time, unlike people like myself or a number of other professors, as Maddie alluded to, who quite regularly worked from home prior to the pandemic. And so we wanted to really sift through that kind of evidence to really understand that specific dynamic rather than worrying about all these other forms of remote work. And I would also highlight that historically, we've understood remote work quite differently. It used to be that the people who worked from home tended to be people who were working in low-wage, lower skill jobs. And that's quite different now, where we see mostly is people who are working from home are actually in high-skilled and high-paid jobs. And we wanted to get into those kinds of dynamics a little bit because there are equity implications coming out of all of these things as well. So like I said, the first 2 questions really are about the labor force piece, about what the impacts of remote and hybrid work are for equity-seeking groups, what it means for the labor market overall, and what it might mean for productivity, and by extension, what it might mean for innovation in our built environments and cities. This is a very simple graph to start us off. We knew at the beginning of the pandemic that right away, almost 40% of the labor force ended up working from home, at least on a temporary basis. Since that time, in about April 2020, March 2020, the proportion of the labor force in Canada that was working from home sort of leveled at about 25%, and over the last few years is sort of declining. Now we're at about, overall nationally, as of November 2023, and I saw the updated numbers just before I checked today to see where we're at. 18.9% of the Canadian labor force works remotely, but there's a mix, and that's what this graph is really getting at. It's really a mix now of not just people working exclusively from home, but a growing proportion of those people, per your own hands going up, but much more systematically. We're now looking at a rough divide, about half and half in terms of the proportion of the workforce that's working in this remote way. Half are working exclusively from home, and half are working in a more hybrid setting. It's also hard to parse this out, even with the formal statistics. And so we really wanted to dig deeper than what this very simple graph can show. We wanted to understand what it would mean for particular groups, what it meant at the beginning of the pandemic, what it might mean now. We knew at the beginning of the pandemic that the people who were most likely to work from home were highly educated, high-income earners, generally working in professional and business services and financial services. We knew that that was the group that was most likely to be working from home, remembering, of course, that a large swath of the labor force is not in such a privileged position. People who are working delivery, people who are working in healthcare, people who are working in construction. These are the kinds of industries where remote work is just not possible, or is not likely to happen on a regular basis. We also knew that it would be people who were in low income and lower skill jobs who were more likely to be working on site and on location. And those patterns continue to be entrenched even as we've moved into the tail end of the pandemic. So that's the kind of dynamic we were thinking about, and we wanted to know a little bit more about what is happening. How is the labor market responding? So one of the things we were able to do is look at where the labor market is headed and what's going on. To do that, we looked at job posting data from a company called Vicinity Jobs, and we looked a little bit at what the demand was from the labor market. We looked at a number of different dimensions. I've just included two here for today. And the first is just to wonder about experience. And the labor market overall is demanding or expects that people who are either very junior or very senior in positions are not going to be working in a remote or hybrid way, but rather it's people in the mid-level positions. There's implications for how that plays out in the office and in managerial structures. And I'm going to get into some of that because, again, there are some equity implications coming out of that, those kinds of things. And we can also see that it's a real split between remote and hybrid work as well. So again, with the hybrid proportion growing over time. So we don't think the world, despite the proclamations made in March and April 2020, we don't think the world is going fully remote. We think the world is sort of landing in a hybrid setting, but I think this is still shaking out. And the data suggests that as well. The data is really, really clear that there's not this sort of an equilibrium model that's arrived on our doorstep as of yet. Another piece of that has to do with education and who and what the labor market expects from people with different kinds of skills or education levels. And again, it's not surprising that when we look at the demand side, what the labor market expects to be moving towards, it is people who are in sort of jobs that require a university education and maybe a graduate degree that are going to be filling in positions that might be remote and hybrid. And again, on the tails, jobs that don't require education or jobs that require a lot of education, those ones are expected more to be in person. So again, there's sort of a tails effect happening here, which I think is interesting and merits a little bit further investigation at some point in time. We also did a lot of interview work with some wonderful key informants. People who are experts in their own right on city building and on the dynamics of the workplace. And they also gave us some good insight into what was happening on the ground and identifying some of the really big challenges, especially around equity and who was allowed or who could and can work remotely and who can't. Again, this sort of reinforces our point about skill and education requirements for jobs. And so we, again, in this particular case, from a work point of view, there are just tremendous equity issues. You have people working for organizations that include tons of frontline service workers, and yet managers and supervisors can sit and oversee the work from the kitchen, and it goes on from there. These kinds of sentiments sort of echo our actual quantitative evidence as well. So I think it's important that there's a corroboration there. But there were some positive sides too. Potentially, there were people who would be able to participate in the labor market that weren't able to because of the option to work either remotely or in a hybrid way. And one of those groups that came up consistently were people who had challenges or physical disabilities of some kind. But also, there's a flip side to some of these things too. That while for some groups this was an excellent opportunity, and we could certainly talk about caregiving as another one of those opportunities, where there's an ability for parents to balance their care needs or people who are caring for elderly people to balance those needs against other things, again, but it was only for smaller groups. So we want to think about this holistically and as a whole. And a real challenge that we identified was that for younger people particularly, there was a loss of, and for newcomers, there's a loss of opportunities for mentorship and networking. And so there's potentially a longer term labor market challenge that we have not even seen the come out yet in the labor force. And this too has an implication for innovation and productivity. And when I finish that, I'll pass it over to Professor Braille. But we also have to think that innovation and productivity are big questions on their own to sort of unpack, and how to relate those to a shift to remote and hybrid work is actually incredibly challenging. There are a very large number of factors that affect both of these things, and I've listed them here: technology adoption, the capacity to innovate, investments of various kinds in the infrastructure environment, in taxes, and R&D. So that parsing apart what part of productivity and innovation might be affected by a shift to remote and hybrid work is really challenging. Also, we have to think about aggregate outcomes at the city level, what's good for the city, versus outcomes that are at the individual or the firm level. Those firm and individual level benefits to the shift to remote and hybrid work are quite obvious. For a business, it might be saving them money on real estate costs. For an individual, it might be time spent commuting or the ability to have some flexibility to do those kinds of tasks I just mentioned. Caregiving is a good example of those. And yet, the value of face-to-face interaction and that being in the office and experiencing the built environment and the potential for random interactions, those things which in the academic literature we refer to as the outcome, the externalities that come from that kind of agglomeration or concentration of activity are often lost in that scenario. And so there's a concern, and a growing one, that there's these outcomes, both for innovation and for the city itself, are being lost in this mix, in this sort of tangle between the employers and the employees on this question of remote work. And on the built environment context itself, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Gray.
Thank you very much, Professor Vinodry. So I think Professor Vinodry has taken us through some of the really sort of wicked challenges and questions on the productivity puzzle, a long time puzzle, and the implications for innovation. When we move to talk about the, I think, equally wicked questions about the impacts of remote and hybrid work on the urban built environment, as well as questions around what we can do with what we could do with office buildings if they should need repurposing, if we're starting to think about using our cities in different ways, and also a caution around not moving too quickly, even though moving slowly also has repercussions. I'm going to start with the regional context, and also looking at Toronto within the North American context. This data is from the School of Cities, very generously shared by Professor Karen Chappell. It is based on cell phone data looking at the large cities across North America. And what we see, and it's cell phone data looking at recovery in the downtown area. It's a proxy for return to work and office-based activities, as well as downtown-based vibrancy more generally. What we see here is that Toronto in this list is very sort of middling, and this data I believe is from around late 2023, and it shows that Toronto's downtown recovery was at about 70% of pre-pandemic. I will say that when we look at this data today, it has actually increased, and some of the more recent data I've seen, both for Toronto, but also across North America, suggests that maybe we're closer to the sort of 75% rate or higher. The other thing we looked at, and I recommend that everybody, when you take on a project, work with a partner who has a skill that's better than yours in all things quantitative, and that's Professor Vinodry. So thank you for this analysis of job posting data, which we think is actually quite novel in terms of being able to understand the prospects and the demand for remote and hybrid work across locations in Ontario. So this is an analysis based on job postings. And what we see here is something quite important and interesting, and we read this in the literature, that actually the biggest cities, the cities with the greatest specialization in, especially in business services, in legal, banking, are the cities in which we have the greatest propensity for remote work. And so it is those places that are sort of large and vibrant, where people are concentrating, that are also sort of paradoxically the places where it's possible to work remotely more. And this poses some really unique challenges for Toronto. What we also see on this graph is that we can see some of the implications for the rest of the Toronto region, especially if we include Waterloo in the Toronto region, but also Oakville and Mississauga. And we see the different sort of implications in terms of postings and opportunities for remote work. Opportunities for remote work, once again, are highest in the biggest cities. So this narrative of the emptying out of cities is really quite interesting with respect to the location of jobs. This here is a workplace mobility index produced by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce Business Data Lab. And here we compare again on the sort of regional, to the Toronto CMA Census Metropolitan Area versus the Toronto downtown. So the blue is the CMA, the red is the downtown. And what we see here is that actually office-based activity dropped off more in the downtown than in the region, and it recovered more quickly at the regional level than at the downtown. Again, demonstrating, highlighting the relatively unique impacts and implications for the center, for the core of the city, and really forcing us to think about what do we understand from this and what do we need to do about it. We also know that transit ridership dropped off dramatically, especially in places with a high focus on and concentration of activity on subways. And so transit ridership in Toronto dropped off by 85–90% at the very start of the pandemic. It has been incredibly slow to recover, not as slow as office activity, but incredibly slow to recover. We are today at about 80% recovery on the TTC. If we think about other sort of big global cities, London is back over 100%, Singapore is back to 100%, New York is also a bit low like us in the mid to high 70 range. The other thing that we're finding on transit, though, is that weekday ridership is still depressed. Weekend ridership is actually above where it was pre-pandemic, which also demonstrates some of the other things that are happening in cities. Here we have Office Occupancy Index. This is an index produced by the Strategic Regional Research Alliance. It is a survey of building managers of a set number of buildings in downtown Toronto. And again, here we see the variety. We can track the beginning of the pandemic. We can track some of the emergent and very sort of more prolific variants like Omicron. And then we see a very, very slow recovery up to about 65% as of February 24. And as I said, this is now, they sent it out yesterday. Oh, it's up to 67. So it's higher on some days. Friday is if you want to avoid traffic, go to the office on Friday, whether that's on transit or on the road, on a vehicle. But so we're starting to see some real sort of variety there. But again, increases, right? And there was some discussion, there were people talking about, well, we're already out of the pandemic in, summer 2022, winter 2023, and look, we're only at 50%. That's where we're getting. And I think this is a really important point here. We have not reached any kind of equilibrium yet. We do not, things continue to change and evolve, so be careful, but strategic and intentional with your plans. This here is some data also from the School of Cities, which has done some amazing work trying to understand the contours of the pandemic and the implications, and looking at post-pandemic recovery. The buildings in red have the lower occupancy or activity, and the buildings in the blue are more vibrant. And one of the things that they discovered, that they found, that they helped to provide evidence for, was that in the buildings around Union Station, especially those of the banks and the law firms, where there is a higher propensity of remote work, there was a greater sort of sense of distress in those buildings. And also there's some, and we talk about it in our report, we look at the difference between Class A buildings. These are the highest quality buildings with the most amenities. There is some suggestion that those are the buildings that have recovered fastest, that are the most attractive, but actually in this particular study, it was the Class B and C office buildings, a little bit further from transit, a little bit older, fewer amenities, that actually were recovering faster. We heard about this also in our interviews that we did. For instance, at the university, when classes went back in person, that was a great boon to activity, especially in Toronto, where we have 3 universities in the downtown, as well as a number of colleges, and this really helped to bring back activity. And when we did this interview, we heard, but we haven't seen the employment occupancy come back yet. The other piece is around, how do we understand who's going to work in an office, why they're going, what are the challenges, what are the things that are keeping them away from there, and then also trying to understand if what we, on the one hand, we value the productivity of people, and we want to make sure that from a people perspective, the city is working. But if we don't have people in the city is not going to be able to thrive or survive or to continue to be a place where we want to come. So a lot of the narrative also focused on thinking about how can we make it, what's in a new downtown, right? A lot of looking at especially examples in Europe and parts of Asia, where the downtown is not just a place of concentrated office buildings, where actually it's a place of very lovely public squares, commercial areas, park spaces. How do we think about making sure that we focus on the visitor economy and visitor tourism, and also focusing on amenities, and not just thinking about, how one of my colleagues said, we're no longer going to be packing and stacking office workers in office towers. And I'm not sure if that's actually true or not, but we do need to think about broadening out what the purpose of downtown is. We also come then to thinking about, how do we do this planning in a time that is quite fragile, in a time in which we don't know what's happening. But we do know that there are ways both to increase the vibrancy in the downtown and to address some other challenges like housing affordability, right? If we have more affordable housing downtown, maybe then we'll have more people willing to spend time in those offices, in the parks, in other sort of amenities in the downtown core. And we'll also be able to address multiple challenges and create a more sustainable urban environment and resilient. So then we get to questions around repurposing offices and downtowns, and a lot of work on this. One is around just repurposing particular office spaces, office buildings, and I have this photo of, I was in London and there was a big sign on the building saying, we're making the most beautiful new 21st century lobby so that you'll want to come here, right? So one is to create, to make spaces attractive, amenable, and thinking about how people want to work in those spaces. Maybe you go to work not to sit in your office by yourself, but rather to have meetings, to go for lunch, to do team building activities. But then we also need to think about, are there spaces that need to be converted? And this is a really difficult question. You may be familiar with Calgary, which has had an incentive program to help convert some office buildings. They had a glut of office space before the pandemic. And so they were more prepared to make that shift. When we look at Toronto, though, and one of the questions that comes up is around how do we make it worthwhile? If it's not worth it financially to do this for a developer, how do we create incentives? 3 more minutes, yes. So one of the things we need to think about, and this is an ongoing discussion, is around the feasibility and financing. If the cost of relative to new construction doesn't make sense, no developer is going near it. And in that kind of case, we need to think about, are there some incentives we can provide? Are there development incentives? Can we release some of the sort of local taxes to reduce the burden? Are there grants that can be provided to help with conversions where and when they might make sense? So I'm going to move to moving forward, what's next? And in summary, I guess what I would say is, first, what we're seeing here are structural shifts, right? We asked this question, is this a cyclical shift? Is this a short-term shift? Or is it a structural long-term shift? And we really do believe that it is a structural shift, that hybrid work in some form is here to stay, and that we have seen shifting values both among employees, employers, and policymakers. In terms of urban vibrancy, this is a period of transition. It's a very it can be a scary period in terms of thinking about where will the revenues come from if we don't have the occupancy and if we don't have the taxes that we need in order to pay for the services we want. We also see that there are some lagging impacts, particularly related to building leases and when those leases end, what will happen with those spaces. And we also firmly believe that it's important to proceed with caution, that we're in an environment of uncertainty and we're in a very complex urban ecosystem, and we really need to consider all of the parts and then to take some very strategic risks with that. I'm not going to go through the recommendations other than to share them here and to say, please read the report. And we still stand by these recommendations. But I do want to end with the question of what's next. And I'll go back to where we started, which was at the start of the pandemic. There were grave concerns about the future of cities. Would people want to live in them? Would there be activities in them? Would we even be wondering about whether we should invest in urban infrastructure? And the answer is, yes, people want to live in cities. We should be investing in the infrastructure. Where the story is not yet written, but there's a lot of difficult questions and important questions to answer to get us to the next future that we need for our city. So thank you very much.
Okay, so now we have three discussants who are going to share some of their own thoughts and perspectives and using the report as a jumping off point. So to get us started is Krista Hanstra. Krista has 25 years of experience as a senior healthcare leader. Krista is the founder and managing director of 4C Strategy Group, a company dedicated to advancing meaningful change. Krista, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is my mic on? Yeah. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the report. I love your open-ended kind of conclusion on this because I'm here to represent working caregivers. So as part of I'm self-employed, but one of the projects that I lead is the Working Caregiver Project at the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. And what we know today is that there's 6 million working caregivers. And when I say working caregiver, I mean someone who's caring for a family member, not a child, unless that child has medical complexity, in which case we do count you as a caregiver. But for people who are caring for aging parents or someone who has an acute illness or a chronic disease. So in Canada, we know there's 6 million working caregivers. We know that of the 1 in 4 Canadians who are caregivers, 62% of them are working. And for those working caregivers, remote work is a huge benefit. It just gives people the flexibility to be able to balance the pressures, the growing pressures of being a working caregiver and their self-employment. I'm representing that lived experience. I am going to use some anecdotes, but it is definitely bared out in the data. I give you one example of a woman who is a parent to a medically complex child. She works full time. She found it very difficult to balance her work and her caregiving, and had asked about 6 months before the pandemic if she could work from home a couple of days a week in order to balance that responsibility. Of course, it wasn't possible at that time. Suddenly, the pandemic hit and working remotely was an option, and all of her colleagues were really flustered trying to figure out how to balance work and home, and her productivity soared because she no longer had to figure out how to be at sick kids or how to be booking appointments or going to the pharmacy or making sure that they had enough medical supplies at home, because all of that could be done during low times during the day, or could actually be done during the day, and she could work at night and still produce. So not only was she more productive, she ended up getting a promotion during the pandemic because she was able to balance it all. So I give that is an extreme example, someone with a medically complex child, but the truth is, we know that right now it's 1 in 4 Canadians. That is projected to go to 1 in 2 Canadians. So if we're now looking at 6 million Canadians who are balancing work and care, we're looking at that going up to 12. I'll just give myself as an example. I am a working caregiver, so I come to this both with looking at the data and doing the research, but also with lived experience. I lived in Toronto for many years. 8 years ago, I moved out of the city to Guelph because I have working caregiving responsibility. I care for my dad, who ironically this week moved into long-term care. And I'm thrilled to be here today because this is respite for me. I get to go into the city today and not have to worry about one thing at home. So working caregivers and having that flexibility in remote work is both beneficial and it allows people who need to be in the workforce to be in the workforce. So I'll just give one more example. We know that 10% of working caregivers extend their time in the workforce because the cost of caregiving, the out-of-pocket expenses, is pretty intense. It can be, in our most recent research, up to $1,000 a month. So for some people, you have to cut back on work while you're caregiving and you have to extend your time in the workforce. So that ability to work remotely does really open the door to further work. And part-time work is the other thing, which we're not talking about today, but part-time work with benefits is also something that really benefits working caregivers. So working caregivers is projected to grow. Parents new parents is projected to stay stable. So I guess I would kind of wrap up my comments by saying if we can find a workforce and a way to plan for new parents in the workforce, can we also think about how to plan for this growing number of working caregivers and our workforce? And is remote work, hybrid work, or flexible work one way to do that?
Fantastic. Thank you, Krista. Next up is Mary Rowe. Mary is the president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, and for 30 years, Mary has acted as an impassioned civic leader and a leading urban advocate championing place-based approaches to building livable and resilient cities. And just to say, Canadian Urban Institute has been working a lot on Main Streets and Main Street recoveries since and coming out of the pandemic. So Mary has a really important and insightful take on this. So Mary, I throw it over to you.
Thanks, Maddie. I'm still absorbing the 30-year piece. Oh, I guess that is how long I've been at this. Just looking out at the crowd here, how many others are in that category? You know, I think, with all due respect to my colleagues, and I was one of your interviewees, and I appreciate the work and I appreciate what ICE is trying to do in terms of merging these domains, but I don't think this is actually the right question. At least I don't. I think there are different questions, but I think what we're talking about is the end of the office. I don't think that's the same as what's the future of. I've got to look at my phone to get my notes, and it is only requiring me to actually give its face recognition. Do you know what I'm getting at? I'm trying to differentiate between the two topics. I think remote work, as you're suggesting, flexible work, being able to care for people, being able to do various things, work in different locations, not be obligated to actually all show up at the same place. Flexible work, that to me is a different topic. Maybe it's a spin-off of this, but I think what we're talking about is the end of the office. The end, if you think about it in urbanism sort of principles, we know that diversity of land use is healthier. It's more productive, it's more resilient, it's more adaptable. And the dilemma we've had is that central business districts have not been diverse. They have been monocultural. And so suddenly we're in a situation where we're saying you can never, ever build anything that only has one purpose, ever. It's just not flexible enough. And you see that in every aspect of urban life. A church can no longer just be a church. A rec center can no longer just be a rec center. A library can't be a library. They've all got to be about 6 different things. So now finally, the most stubborn, perhaps, piece of land use and built form that we've had is the Verdammt office, and it's changing. So that's what I would prefer we be talking about, is what is the future of the office. And I think it extends to every piece of infrastructure we have. What's the future of transit? Well, it's obviously to get us around, but also you could have a much different experience on transit if we invested in the experience of transit differently and didn't ask it to just do one thing, get me from A to B, but actually get the place where I can get where I can get some food, where I can get my COVID vaccine, where I can have some other kind of services. I can renew my driver's license, whatever the hell it is, but you multi-purpose every aspect of urban life. We don't expect only one thing from a park now. Parks serve a gazillion purposes now. So I think that would be my little subtle piece here, is that I don't think it's about remote work. I think it's about the end of the office. The second thing I will say, and I know everybody's said it lots and it's well known, and I don't know, I agree with you. I think the jury's out. The diminishment of opportunity to bump into someone who is not like you has a gazillion implications that we don't fully get yet. A gazillion. Diminishment of urban empathy, all sorts of stuff. So the more that we have created the situation, and I totally agree with you, it's organized by class. It has all sorts of racial components to it. People that, when you said the privilege, somebody, I think it was you, Tara, said the privilege of working from home. Honestly, do you find working from home a privilege? What kind of home do you guys have? Like, it's not a privilege for me. Anyway, I got a lot of dishes to do. I got a lot of pets that are wanting attention. Like, you know, I look at work from home and think, this has given me a license to be the worst workaholic I've ever been in my 30 years of working. I just work all the time. It's horrible in that way. It's completely altered. So there are all these psychological liabilities that are associated with this. And I bumped into somebody this morning on my main street getting my coffee, young woman, works for Shopify, in her 20s, designer, in my neighborhood. I said, what are you doing? She said, well, I work from home. I said, really? How's that work out? This is about 8 o'clock in the morning. And she said, it's horrible. I only go into the office twice a week. And I said, why do you go? She said, for the food. And she said, there's no culture there. I don't know anybody. I don't meet with anybody. So I think we've got to really, that's where I'm a little concerned about this. I mean, I hear you on, I mean, you know, Shauna, we talk about this stuff all the time, transit use, public services, losing resources. These are all serious things. I think this piece has got to be, how do you repurpose built environment assets to attract people to bump into someone who is not like them? And I don't know whether that's going, you know, I heard that the path now, we've got golf simulators down there. I love this juxtaposition. In the path, here's some of the new tenants in the path. We got golf simulators. We got IVF clinics. You go downtown to get your IVF treatment. You go downtown to do something else. So I think we have to reimagine what's going to continue to invite people into spaces. And I think we just have to totally blow the lid off that. So don't have, maybe here, you heard it here first, maybe we don't have such compressed university campuses. Maybe we allow post-secondary campuses to distribute much more broadly across a broader area of the downtown, like in NYU. One of the reasons that lower Manhattan or lower Midtown Manhattan is more resilient is because of NYU. So could we start looking at adapting that? Could we, you know, you read in the paper that the provincial government's going to buy some building? Good, let them do that. Like, let's get more diverse tenant mixes into these spaces. So I just think, Tobias is in the room, there are other people from the city of Toronto. I think we need to look at what have we got, what rules have we got that we can take off the books that are inhibiting creative things happening. We have no idea what might happen. Maybe there'll be more IVF clinics. Maybe there's going to be more padel ball. Maybe there's going to be bowling. Bowling's coming back. You know, I don't know what it's going to be, but I would like to see the rules get lifted off. The last thing that I will say about this, and then I'll shut up. Why did we make work so unappealing? Right? All you folks who are under 30, blame me. What was it that we thought we were doing, that we made work for white collar workers such an onerous thing that if you had the choice to stay away, you chose to stay away? I run a national organization. We are challenged by not being in the same space together. We are trying to deal with significant problems in cities across the country and not being in the same location, which we can't be because we're a national thing. And I've got staff in Vancouver and Calgary and Halifax, and they're everywhere. We can't be in the same space. And I lament it every day because it's really hard for us to solve problems together, only virtually. Really, really hard. So what did we do to the work environment that we have to coax? Apparently at Shopify, they're bribing you with food. When did it get, what were we thinking? I'd be interested to hear from the kids under 30, kids, young people. Is it really about money? Yeah. About money because of the commute? Yeah, but if you could live next, because you see, here's the problem with that argument in terms of their data. Even when you have a workforce that is able to walk to the office, they don't come. So I hear you about the money part, but even people who live 3 blocks away, somehow, living with 4 people or whatever, they don't come into the office.
Question that our audience can then weigh in on and ask of the panel momentarily. Thank you, Mary. Next up is Rory McNeil. Rory is Senior Planner with the City of Toronto, Toronto's Planning Division in Strategic Initiatives, Policy Analysis. She is currently the project lead on the Office Space Needs Study. So very apropos and pertinent to what we're talking about today. Rory, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. And Mary, you're right. We have a few policies that we would probably start thinking about a little bit differently. So, you know, we see a lot of the knock-on effects that the office market vacancies and the office market challenges are having with the city. You know, vibrancy, local regional economies, the fear of the urban doom loop is much discussed. And we have some policies specifically in the downtown core, certain parts of the downtown, and certain parts of Young Eglinton, and there's some others scattered across the city that do require a one-to-one replacement of office space if it's proposed to be removed. Of course, most of the city, we do not have that policy. But in those are some of our key office nodes, and they do have this very strict requirement. So we started the study October last year, the office space needs study, to take another look at some of those policies, revision them, think about how we can start to address some of the issues we're seeing. So when I'm going to talk about conversions, I'm going to talk about conversions in a few different ways. And the one that we always are talking about is within the existing buildings. That's the hot topic. But we also looked at the issue from additions to existing buildings. So there's a lot of pent-up demand, especially in the downtown in Young Eglinton. You can add stories to existing buildings. If you have a 12-story office, put 30 stories of residential on top. And we have demos and rebuilds. We also looked at it from that perspective because we are seeing demand for that in development. So in approaching the issue, we tried to develop 5 key principles. One, we wanted to balance, consider the need for new housing, much needed market rate, affordable housing, but also employment opportunities for the long term. If it's not office, maybe it's something else. Want to look at duration, so that any new policy direction should be demand responsive, that not be so rigid as the future goes on. Look at the extent. There's a lot of variability in local markets, local context, different classes of office. Public benefit. What key city building objectives can we achieve during this time? What do we need to see? And feasibility. Policies should consider both it should consider the costs so that we can achieve those short and long-term goals. So we retained Parcel Economics, that is a land economist firm, to look at some of these issues and conducted a series of stakeholder interviews, public engagements to look at it. So what do we find? Well, the office market, not doing great, but vacancies vary significantly across districts, across classes. And there's a lot of debate about different classes of office and how that is interacting with the market. We see some demand within key nodes like the financial district and the unique circumstance that is Union Station, but expansion of supply is not likely to be warranted in anytime soon. And in fact, Parcel took a look at some projections. They tried to project out what the office demand is, and they said at least 10 years out, 2034, that's the first possible instance that supply and demand could reconcile. It's not quite the end of the office, but maybe it's the end of the standalone office. It's about that, what percentage of the existing office space can we now look at as well to be replaced? So are we concerned about long-term impacts to office? By the way, I'll note too, those projections, there's a lot of variables there as well that could push office demand out much farther than 2034. So we looked at the pro forma testing for these different types of conversions to test what is feasible in the current market in those different scenarios, and what amount of space could be replaced with these uses that we need, like affordable housing and alternative non-residential uses to allow for a mix. And so speaking from a private development perspective, without incentives, and generally speaking in Toronto, the existing building conversions within the existing building envelopes, they're not so feasible, right? We have market condo development that doesn't come close to hitting a threshold rate of return needed to achieve a feasible development within that. That's not to say it can't be done, and there are some very interesting ways in which we've seen ideas about that. But right now we aren't seeing much of a demand for it, and we haven't received that type of development application coming in. Now, additions to existing buildings, adding density on top, and demos and rebuilds, well, that we've seen quite a bit of. We've seen quite a bit of demand for that, and we're looking at that and seeing what can we get out of it. So where you have existing office space, the pro forma analysis shows that you can replace something like 25% of that space with affordable housing or with other alternative non-residential uses. And that's been our sort of recommended policy approach so far. That we should reduce office replacement, make it more flexible for redevelopment to take place, so that 25% of the existing office be replaced with one of these other priorities that we have. And that can be any non-residential use, affordable housing or supportive housing, and the remaining 75%, any additions on top of that could be market residential. And finally, key to this framework, we want to keep looking at the issue. So 4 years out, we want to reassess how much office space is gone, what is the office market looking like, are we improving in that? So in the short term, we are satisfied that some loss of office can even be a good thing, and there's some flexibility there to be had. But long and potentially the medium term, we do see some return to office demand, but that is a hard to predict situation, and we'll be monitoring as time goes on. And finally, we are still working on this project. So we're doing some initial analysis around incentives, much discussed in the Calgary model. We'll be reporting out with more information later in this year and into next year. And you can find more information on our website if you search Toronto Office Study. I should bring it up. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rory. Okay, so now we're going to have a bit of a facilitated discussion. For me, the first question that comes to mind is to start thinking, like, when you, in your interviews and in your research, when people are working remotely, do we have any idea what they're actually doing during that remote time? Like, this has been both one of the concerns that employers have had, but also one of the questions about productivity and not just immediate productivity, but sustained productivity and creativity. Do we know what is happening in those remote workplaces?
Do you mean what we're personally doing when we're working remotely, or the people we interviewed?
People, you can take it wherever you would like.
I mean, I think it's clear that many people are doing a lot of work, and some people are like Mary and maybe me, and I'm sure other people are doing more work than they ever did. I'm sure there are also, the idea around surveillance of workers and surveillance to make sure, you can work remotely, but actually keep your camera on all the time, or make sure you're available and you haven't gone out to the store, you haven't done this or you haven't done that. I have a 23-year-old daughter who works remotely 2 days a week. 2 days a week. And I will say that, without getting her into any trouble, she does work very diligently, but it's very nice that she can go out at night and roll out of bed 2 minutes before 9 so that she can be on a computer, right? And that's a benefit, right? That's a value. People are doing laundry, they're cooking, they're walking their pets. I don't know.
So Tara, can I just to zero in then? Not just, I know we've heard a lot about the quantity of work and when people work from home, that it starts to spread into many hours, and Mary mentioned the amount of work. What do we know about distracted work? Like if you're on a call, but you're also doing the dishes, or you're doing your laundry,
Personally,
or
you want me to talk about that personally?
I'm using the royal, not the you, but like, are people actually giving 100% of their focus to their work when they're working in a place that they're not directly across from someone?
Right. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think here, kind of coming back from the anecdotal of, whether or not I'm doing my dishes while I'm also on a Zoom call or marking or whatever it is or not, putting those things aside and being more, more serious about the evidence on the productivity piece is really mixed. The actual evidence says that in some instances, people are far more productive. And, this is like coming to the anecdote, Mary or Shauna saying, oh, yes, I'm working a lot harder and longer. I think the flip side is there's other instances where that's not the case. And the issues that Shauna raises around surveillance are part of, I think, are from the employer's side intended to address that distracted work issue. I think that, the jury's out about all of that. But if everyone notices if they use Microsoft Teams, there's all those other, whether you're, it changes. If you're not tapping on your keyboard, it changes to red. And all of that information is being collected by employers,
Wait,
right?
it is?
Yes. I mean,
kidding.
the employer may choose to
They're
not
getting a
use it,
report
but
on you.
Yeah.
but the
Can I comment, though?
the ability for employers to do that, so there's a real issue about how actively employers are using the tools for surveillance.
Interesting. Mary?
Yeah, well, I think my comment here would be about agency. It's back to why did we make work so horrible that people are so keen to never do it again, never come back into the office again? Not work horrible, we made the office horrible. Part of it, I think, is people felt they had no agency. And so there's like this big, are we taping this? Is this going out? It's like this big collective fuck you, That's what we're in the midst of. And so
They just did the beeping over there.
yeah, well, there you go. They've never heard that word before, but that's what I feel like we've gone through, is this piece of kind of, I got sick and tired of being told when I had to be there and what I had to do. And I don't know if we'll get that out of our system, because there obviously wasn't enough agency. People did feel compelled and pushed in a particular kind of way. But when you talk about distracted work, I feel like a virtual work, it's not doing dishes. It's the fact that you are not scrutinized by anybody around you. And so you can multitask, do 7 different things while you're on that Teams chat. And I feel that affects our capacity to actually discipline ourselves, be focused, do deep work. Because it's just, this is it, you don't have somebody over next to you who's noticing that you're doing 7 things while you're on that Teams chat. And you wouldn't do it if you were in a collective environment.
Yeah, although ironically, can I
just-
just,
Yeah.
I was
and
going to say,
then-
ironically, during our interview work, in fact, people talked about the home days as being the days to do that deep work where they weren't being interrupted
By
by
people.
people
By
in
people.
the office, right? So it.
Because they could
that's a
scroll social media and do
contradiction
everything
there.
else, and none of those people were looking at them, judging them.
Krista?
I mean, I have an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
I've been self-employed for 10 years. I definitely don't work less. I just work differently. And if I don't produce, I don't get paid.
Yeah.
So I'm way more productive. I worked from home when I was still employed full-time. I worked from home, 10 plus years ago, 1 day a week. I could do what I did in the office in 3 hours because I didn't have all of the distractions around me. So it is that focused time for sure. I'm not going to say that I don't multitask, but at the end of the day, if I don't output if I'm self-employed, I don't get paid. So, I mean, I can tell you that I think it is not a one size and not a one answer fits all. But for people who know how to work at home, it did take me a while to settle into the routine and really get focused. But I'm a big proponent that you can be a lot more productive at home.
Rory, maybe I'll come to you and ask about the city's response. What sense of urgency has the city had? I mean, the city of Toronto is a big city and a big organization. I would say as a city more generally, not just the administration, but we have a reputation of probably overstudying things and loving pilots. So, this was a moment where the world changed very quickly. How rapidly and did we respond, and how serious are we to actually implementing the type of change that would be necessary to keep up with our peers?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't think the city's known for rapid responses. And it's been evolving since 2020, right? And I think like the real conversation around office and all that, when did that take off? It was really, I think office landlords, office market tenants started to get really worried at some point, and circa 2022, something like that. And the media conversation really took off. There's a certain point where I think like my colleagues and I were getting sent articles day after day by our colleagues. And that there's a big political push to try and to address some of what we've been hearing and some of the concerns. So there was absolutely a big push at a certain point where things kicked into overgear, and we did try to rapidly address some of this. And while the city policy is still under review to come up with a new direction, we have been implementing an interim direction and trying to work with development and to guide along a new route.
I have a follow-up question for Rory.
I was going to come to you actually, Mary, with a follow-up, which was about what our peers are doing. You're a national organization.
Yeah.
What are our peers, and especially those who maybe have a culture and a reputation of kind of moving quickly and being more experimental than us?
Who are you thinking has a reputation for moving quickly? Just
I couldn't possibly say.
just thinking, just wondering. I was going to ask Rory and the authors of the study about, is anybody in a Canadian city starting to flag a concern about commercial devaluation of commercial buildings? Because in the United States, we're seeing write-downs. And when I go to the commercial real estate sector, are you here or are you too busy out doing deals? When I talk to the commercial real estate sector in Toronto and in Calgary, we got this. They won't admit that there's any kind of massive devaluation coming. Is anybody any beating counter in the city saying, holy shit, this is what's going to come at us? And did you start to see this? Like, when are we going to hit the cliff that New York has hit?
Yeah.
Well, I think we already have started to, in just maybe a week or two. The problem with with this kind of work is like, it's like just in time. You're like, wait, there's one more thing I have to add. But right, probably a week or two before we finished the report, there was a story in the Globe or the Star that mimicked a story in the New York Times about our pension funds having to really think through what was happening with office holdings and whether to write them down and how much they were going to lose and what that was going to mean in terms of all kinds of other spillover effects.
I mean, there are lots of Armageddon pictures here about what's ahead. Are you, is anybody in the city worried about?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been looking at the data, and so
Mhm.
far in Toronto, like valuations have absolutely gone down,
Mhm.
but they haven't dropped off the cliff,
Yeah.
right? I mean, Calgary is the
Yeah, that they
example
did.
where
Yeah.
things did drop off the cliff.
Yeah.
And developers picking up offices in foreclosure in some
Mhm.
instances, but we haven't seen that yet in Toronto. It's unclear at this point where that will
I mean,
land.
you know, there were 400 empty office floors in Calgary before of COVID.
Yeah.
And so they, as you say, they've been in crisis since 2013. But it's interesting. I sort of puzzle with it myself, you know. Did you look at the the ownership structure when you showed that slide of the red and the yellow? Did you look at the ownership structure of those buildings? And one question I would say do we have more institutional owners? And therefore, are they too big to fill? Just saying. Or versus if you had, like in New York, you have many small owners of buildings. And so that might suggest that it's more resilient versus our downtown cores, which in Calgary were owned by almost only one sector. And in Toronto, the fire sector owns most of those buildings. So does that make us more resilient, less, more at risk?
No, I mean, we did. I mean, the short answer is, I think there's more work to be done.
We don't know.
We had to do a broad across these 5 questions. And so
Yeah.
we couldn't go as deep as we would want on any
Mhm.
one of them. And one where I think there's more room to look into the data was around the real estate piece, which we got. So that data came to us from the city. And so we looked a little bit at Class A versus BC, and we looked at that, both for the city proper versus the region. We didn't include any of our real estate data today. It's in the report, but there's an interesting shift between the downtown and the rest of the region. And
Yeah.
the vicinity data shows that as well with job demand. So there's a rebalancing across the
Yeah.
broader region where the depression is in the core with potentially the suburban nodes kind of rising
So
up a
then
little
there's an
bit. But
opportunity.
there's a hypothesis in there that needs a little bit more digging.
I hope somebody is trying, because there's an opportunity then to repurpose what the core looks like.
Mhm.
In answer to your question about where would the most innovative stuff be, I can tell you right now, it's in Montreal.
Okay, interesting.
Because they were abandoned by the Fortune 500 companies in 1980, so 45 years ago, they said, whoops, they lost the big tenants that basically made Toronto, just saying, and they decamped out of Montreal, out of the Quebec community because of the language laws there. And what it's meant is that you have a very, very resilient local economic structure in Montreal. So less chains, less big corporate decisions that are being made by remote landlords. And so they're more resilient, and the ownership is much more localized. So I'm not saying Montreal is without challenge. It's got lots, but that's where we see people taking risks and doing things. It's always been the case for the last 45 years.
Roy?
Maybe I'll just add to, like, so far, last I heard, at least with the data, like the rental cost, the rent that is being charged for offices hasn't dropped yet either. They're still charging the same
My lease is
rent.
the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're offering other incentives to try and get people on board, but so far the rental market hasn't taken that hit yet. Will it? Maybe. I think that's the question. And that's I think where we'll start to see some real challenges potentially. But there's that, and then some of these big REITs also appear to be pivoting some of their investments. Right. There's a push now towards more residential from some of the traditional office developers, which has been interesting to see as a vehicle for these REITs.
I'm glad you're watching
Tara,
that.
did you want to
Yeah.
jump in? So one of the questions I have then is about public policy, and especially what we've been hearing from city mayors in particular, who have been imploring their big employers, in Ottawa's case, the federal government, in other cases, the big banks and businesses, to bring their workers back. Not necessarily making arguments that it's better for work or for workers, but that it's necessary for the city to survive. Do we think is that a good reason to be bringing people back? For the city rather than for the work itself? Tara and Shauna, maybe I'll start with you.
This is a question about which there's a lot of disagreement. And I will say that I have heard from some people, mostly younger people, 30 and under range, I would say that this is just like, this is a problem for capitalism
Yeah.
and capitalists. And why should we care? Right? Why should we go to work just so that you can, make money on your building and, support your public infrastructure, et cetera? From Tara and I have discussed, well, actually, there are lots of good reasons why we should we should support our cities. And there are lots of things that they do for people, for our quality of life, for society at large, that are, really good reasons to say, hey, we should all come down here. I do take issue, Mary, I just want you to swear one more time, but I do take issue with Mary's comment that like, it's not the end of the city. I agree. It's the end of the office, but it's also not the end of the office, because if I understood Rory's comment properly, then what we're looking at is a 25% reduction, not 100%, not a 50%, just 20. So it's not the end of the office. And I think it's the, there's a moment of real change, but it's just not the end.
Krista, maybe I'll ask you that question. I mean, about how you feel about from a care worker perspective. How do you see this idea of bringing people back to work from, to help save the city, so to speak? Does this argument have any sway, or you just like, I just want to do my job and do it to the best of my ability and keep my other obligations,
Yeah, I
up to
think,
date?
I mean, I also think it's not a one size fits all, but I, for caregivers too, like
Yeah.
caregivers do sometimes want to be in the office in order to have that respite from work. So I don't think it's necessarily, but the sort of sitting in an office just for the sake of sitting in the office, I don't think is up to the workers. I would say the other interesting thing that we looked at when we were looking at the needs of working caregivers is that the Gen Alphas and the Gen Zs are also looking for the same things that would benefit working caregivers. So there's kind of a win-win there. When you think about what it is that they need and what they want, it's what caregivers need and want too. So
Great. Okay, so did you want
I
to jump
really
in?
just want to
Yeah,
jump in. I
please.
think for two reasons. One, I think, when we think about bringing people back to the office or bringing back people back to work, I think we're losing sight of a few things here, right? And one of them is that it's not just the office workers who come to their tall big buildings in the CBD. It's all the knock-on things they might do when they are in the city. All the things that we think about as placemaking. Placemaking was a big part of what we ended up recommending at the end as well, for people who want to be there, and also for the kinds of jobs that creates as well. So we're not just losing, the professional white collar workers working in the bank. We're then also losing all the other work that goes along with that, right? The people who clean those buildings, the people who are serving coffee, the people who are, maintaining buildings. There's a large part of the economy that goes with it. And so I do think we need to remember that. And the other thing we do need to remember while we're talking, I also don't agree, it's just not the end of the office. But I love all the swearing.
No.
But
I'll
I
clarify.
think we agree on a lot of
Mhm.
things, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than it's not the end of the office.
Mhm.
Because we've got to remember that even, at the height of the pandemic, when people were sent home, there was still 60% of everybody
Mhm.
who wasn't at home. They
Mhm.
were going to work, right?
Mhm.
And some of that work was in offices.
Mhm.
And so I do think we need to think very carefully about this question, that when we think about that, remember that even now, if it's like 18.9% of the Canadian workforce, we're still talking about a very large proportion of the workforce that must go to work. And I'm the same to all these different kinds of locations. And the city is for all of that.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
I
gonna-
don't think that I'm saying the end of the office. I'm trying to mirror your structure here about,
Well,
is it this, but
we got given this title.
yeah. Oh, did you?
So
Okay.
I'm going to hold
Oh,
us
well.
here for a
But I think it's more that what I'm arguing for here is that we don't have single purpose uses of
Mm.
anything anymore. And so you can't just be in office.
And I think we agree with you on that.
Yeah.
So
And
I'm-
if you could, I had a medical appointment today at Bay and Bloor. I went up to the 4th floor of an office building. If that building were mixed and you
Yes.
could live on the 10th floor of that building where your dad is and go down and get your medical appointment on the 4th floor and then walk across the street and
I'm
spend some
in.
time, right?
Mhm.
So in Ottawa,
Now.
yeah, CUI was involved in trying to deal with the Ottawa challenge.
Yeah.
And this notion that you just pound the table and cajole people to come back to work is ludicrous. Nobody will do it. And you saw the public sector union response was, it's not our job to rebuild downtown, thanks, we're not coming back. And I think we've got to make I think what's going to happen, I think it's going to happen whether we like it or not, because Rory and Tobias, and you're going to pull all the rules back, and we're going to unleash hell in a really positive way. And something fabulous is going to start to manifest in these spaces. And we're going to see more and more people living downtown and living on the 12th floor. And they're going to work on the 6th floor for half a day. And then they're going to go up and deal with their parent or take the dog out. And we're going to basically build more mixed communities. You know, when in doubt, people. Bring more people in.
Well, it will be an absolute Toronto miracle when the rules get peeled back and we let flowers bloom. But so we have about 10 minutes now, and I want to open it up to audience questions. So perhaps you can, we have a roving mic. My request, just because we're a bit short on time, is to perhaps say your name, but please keep your question to a question, not that you're the sixth panelist.
Thanks very much. Excuse me, my name's Matt Dorff. Thank you very much for the discussion, really interesting. I think it's a very complex topic, mainly because of the dynamism around it, and it's constantly changing. To your point, Amazon's announcement last week will have material impact on this. And I think there's a lot of competing agendas at play. One thing that we have to consider is why are workers being asked to come back? Is there a natural attrition piece to this? Is there other structural pieces to this, etc.? So the point being that it's complex. But the most kind of alarming thing that I've heard in this talk, I went to the Empire Club last week for a talk on making Canada a stronger relationship with America, and there's some laughter around it, but in all seriousness, I think the most alarming thing is that the city says it's going to relook at this in 4 years. There's clearly sentiment that policy is impossible to change. Permitting is
Question?
so hard. Why is there no urgency around this from the city, from infrastructure? It's incredibly alarming on a municipal level, on a provincial level, and on a federal level in Canada. And it's having material impacts on the economy, the job market, transportation, and this.
Great. Okay, so Rory, I think that sounds like a question to
that's
you.
me, yeah.
That's to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of urgency around it, and I think we have already put forward a new policy direction. We can talk more about that specifically, and we've been working on an interim basis to try and address some of this, including working with developers, working with applicants as they come in over the course of the last couple of years. So there certainly is an urgency. Appreciate the concern, and that it is municipal government. We never do work fast enough. I think that is certainly fair.
Okay, at the back, there was a question. Someone have a hand up at the back? Please.
Hi, thanks so much for the information and the discussion. I'm Tobias Novogrodsky. I am with the City of Toronto. I'm interested in the panel's perspective on the potential intersection between, let's call it macro structural policy, be it at the municipal level or otherwise, but also micro policy that shapes multiple uses of space in urban areas. It could be changes to noise bylaws. It could be the use of hydraulic bollards in Toronto that allow us to use streets in different ways. It could be any number of things that actually make it easier to imagine and use space differently in our cities. And I'm wondering about examples maybe from data or from the city environment, Rory, in terms of those conversations, and Mary, the conversations you're having nationally about that mix between creating a more enabling environment for multiple uses in multiple ways, not just the big wait for the big zoning bylaw change to happen or not. There's other things that need to come into the mix, and I'm curious about the panel's perspective on that.
Krista, do you want to take that one? Do you want to, maybe a question, maybe I'll, for you, and then I'll go to Mary, but would nicer public spaces or better restaurants, is that something that would attract you to come, to want to be in an office more? Or do you just have other pressures that are so great that it just outweighs any of those benefits?
I would say the biggest thing, okay, from self-employed, also working caregiver, the multi-use space would really draw me in. And the idea of creating collaboration spaces, as someone who's self-employed, that's a huge opportunity. That's where, you know, I've honed my skills to facilitate large group discussions online over the pandemic. But when I went back in person, first of all, I had to relearn how to do it in person.
Yeah.
But secondly, it is a different tone. So I'm not saying one is better than the other, but they're definitely different. And there's huge value to that collaboration space and innovation space and multi-purpose space for sure. That would bring me back downtown.
Mary, Tobias's question seems to be a lot around the if you build it, will they come type of.
You know, it's interesting. We did a city talk today. A lot of you follow city talk, so I know you don't need to be reminded of it, but we did it on Main Streets again. And we had a guy there from New York City talking about what kinds of interventions they're doing. And they're all micro interventions. That's the scale they have to work at across the 5 boroughs in the US. And I sort of reaffirmed with him, you know, New York, he's having a few problems, the mayor, but you read the papers. But the notion of a city of yes is very interesting as an adage. And my version of that is the good old principle, you know, better to ask for forgiveness than permission. So if we could get ourselves to an awareness, which I think you guys did very well at the city during the pandemic. I think we went hyper-local really well. We found ways to get porta potties into parks, to open streets. I'd love us to be able to get back into that tangible kind of action, try some stuff, work at a human scale, and people will get much more comfortable if they start to see things work. And you just try it and see if it works. So that's my view, is that we should, and that's why conversions, in my view, the best is to try some smaller buildings, which is what's happening. And then people start to see it. Don't start with 180 Wellington, you know, start with smaller bites, right?
Next, there was another question on the side here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jordan.
Hi, Jordan.
For the panel more generally, do you feel that the design of this study has led to an aggressively zero-sum perspective on the subject? For example, we're hearing a lot of terms like lost jobs, lost spending. It seems strange to me that spending that I'm doing in my local community, now that I have the freedom to work from home, is treated as lost rather than reallocated, because a city that I can't afford to live in or work in which has effectively built a moat around itself, wants my money back. That seems like that perspective seems strange to me. We have representatives from the city of Toronto, but not from any of the other cities that have benefited from a shift to work from home, that have seen local spending increase, that have seen more people spending more time closer to their communities, et cetera. Why does that perspective seem so pervasive, would be my question.
Tara, maybe I'll start with you on this one.
Lucky me. Okay. Okay. Well, one of the things we actually do talk about in our study is the sort of the tension between the downtown core and the wider region. And that is about a reallocation question, right? And so we do notice that, but there is a real issue at stake. What we know, if we lose all of that out of the central part of the central downtown plays an important role that outsizes its location. And so we are aware of what that might mean in the longer run. And so I think that's the beginning of our concern there. So I take your point. I think we do see a reallocation of activity, and some of that is positive and some of that is less so. And I think that we're trying to sort that out still, I would think.
Rory?
Yeah,
And then Sean will come to you.
Okay, I disagree with Tara.
You disagree?
Agree.
Oh, you agree. Okay.
Uh-oh.
yeah.
Okay, Rory.
I will say I won't comment on certain politicians' push to like bring office workers to certain areas. But based on the work that we've been doing with the office space needs study, we have assumed that remote hybrid work is here to stay. That things have shifted, and that they will continue to shift and change in the future. So we've really taken that perspective and those assumptions with this study.
Yes.
Hi. So, hearing all of this is really interesting. And it is important to note that there has been some companies who have always been remote. CMHC, for example, you can work anywhere in Ontario. That's been the case even before the pandemic. COVID and everything else that happened led to quick transitions, quick adapting. Do you think it's too early right now to start making a doom and gloom kind of perspective in terms of what the hybrid system looks like without giving it time to settle? Because really, how many years we have of being able to multitask at home, being able to do remote work, to really perfect it to a point in which it's actually a system that we can still connect with people, that we can still do creativity. I think in my point of view, it's more about shitty management. Doesn't matter if you're a manager in the office or if you're doing it virtually, right? If you don't facilitate and you don't, drive forward the teams that you work with, it doesn't matter if you have them in front of you or if you have them in remote. People want to work because they are excited to be working, because they're excited of the end goal, and you can't put a location on that. So I challenge on that. And with regards to also the caregiver, so I'm a chair of Your Cumber. Your Cumber is a school for children with special needs. I can tell you for a fact that it was completely the opposite, that actually parents with special needs children were not able to get any work done because they needed to teach the kids during the day and dedicate time to that, and they couldn't work. So their lived experience was a constant one where they needed to get back to work. And so they suffer significantly through that. Not to mention like hospital visits, everything else was like video camera, remote. It was not very effective. So I'm not sure if that's a different segment of the population that you work with. So again, back to my first question, right? Do you think that it's too early to start setting up this type of response when we haven't given this new shift an opportunity to adapt?
Yeah, Mary,
So
you
I
take
totally
this.
agree with you. And I just want to echo the comment from the question at the back. I don't think it's a zero-sum game either. I think we're just reshuffling the deck, right? Like there's a redistribution happening. Here's what I would say about the spending the money, if you're staying at home. I'm trying to get people off their kitchen tables. That's all. Because I don't know if we actually have the data. We do stuff at COI about My Main Streets. I don't know if we have the data to suggest that the money that they're not spending downtown in that cafe, they now spend in their main streets. Not sure they do. I think they're still kind of circling a much narrower thing. If we were to see suddenly that you can be a distributed worker and that you're still having some interaction with someone who's not like you because you go out onto the main street and there's a co-working space there, or you have some engagement, and we start to create those kinds of collaborative teams so that we don't lose the benefit of collaboration and creativity and adjacency. And if that's going to happen in local smaller units rather than schlepping yourself down to the 80th floor, great. And I also do think that what we may see is a diversification of locations, period. More flexible spaces in the downtown CBDs that'll become something else, and in the local communities. So you're going to see more and more people doing different kinds of things at different scales, close to their home or not. And then we're just going to be much more flexible. So those are the rules I'd like to change, things that are preventing us from letting these things evolve.
Shauna?
Just briefly, I wanted to say that first, I think, again, it's too soon to make final declarations about what the impact has been, and yet we do know that some form of hybrid work is here to stay, and also that the office isn't dead, and neither is the city. And at the same time, when we think about, where are we going whether it's in our neighborhoods, how are we redistributing activities? We also have been very focused on redistributing commercial activities, redistributing spending. And I think again, as Mary pointed out, we have to think about how, what's the impact on people, right, on their connections with one another. And so how do we think about it even more broadly than just, are you, instead of spending your money or your time, going to an office and buying your groceries or getting your coffee near the office, are you just putting that in your neighborhood instead? But also, how is the sort of broader experience of your day-to-day sort of life and relationships and interconnections and the potential for increased, whether it's productivity or new innovation, new ideas, how do our cities and also our neighborhoods facilitate that?
At the back, I'll give you the last question. We're just about at time. Yes, please. Yep.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. My name is Sam. I'm a student in the Master Global Affairs program in my second year. I was curious a little bit about what you think might be the implications into how Canadian cities, specifically those who are on the outskirts, those that are more suburban or smaller communities, might be impacted by this long term. I think it was already alluded to just earlier in the discussion how urban areas kind of go beyond and kind of punch above their weight in terms of how much they contribute. If I'm not mistaken, in most urban areas, they contribute far more in tax revenue than they actually require, and they, to a large degree, subsidize suburban parts of the society. So when we have this framework wherein it is likely that most individuals who are working from home are not contributing as much in their local economies as much they would have previously in the urban ones, and there's a net negative outcome for total expenditures. How do you envision the future of the fabric of Canadian municipalities evolving? And I bring this up because I think there have been many discussions about how in the West, especially North America, the last several decades, post-World War II was very car-centric, not really ideal for societal cohesion, very much not focused on transit. And that's been, at least by many commentators, a big reason why we have seen some of the negative impacts on society, such as reduced social cohesion and other negative implications. Do you feel that because there'll be more opportunities for remote work, there'll be further incentive for municipalities, especially suburban municipalities, to be reorganized and densified so that they can better be able to actually serve the needs of residents? Or do you feel that this is potentially a secondary significant problem that could occur if there isn't, I guess, urgent action taken by policymakers?
Thank you for the question, Shauna. I'll give you maybe the last word on this, a geography type of question. Or Tara, if you want to take this one.
Tara's gonna take.
Tara's gonna take
Tara.
it. Oh, geez.
So this is a question about smaller municipalities and
Right.
especially suburban ones, perhaps around big cities, which
Right,
grew
yeah.
quickly during the pandemic and now
Well,
maybe are having a reshuffling.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is again, I think complicated and has a little bit to do with what was already there prior to the pandemic in terms of how well some of those places were connected into the core to begin with. I'm thinking a little bit about this. Our offices are on the Mississauga campus of the University of Toronto, and so I've spent a lot of time learning a lot more about the city of Mississauga as an example, and they are a place that's thinking about densifying their downtown. I use that word very loosely because it's a mall. But anyone from Mississauga here. But I think more broadly, the question as posed was, is the fabric of Canadian cities and municipalities evolving as a result of the pandemic? And I think that again, is a real question about where people move to, or if people moved at all. That's a sort of an open empirical question as to whether that happened and whether they are in fact growing faster than their counterparts in the city. Layering on top of that, and we didn't talk about this at all, was the question of housing and housing affordability. And we do touch on this at the end, that this has been, the other sort of elephant in the room affecting this whole calculus about where people will live and work and play. And I think that we can't, and of course it's now the end of our panel, this is another big question that sort of looms large and intersects with these other already complex questions about connectivity and mobility and how we invest in the infrastructure to allow for all of that growth to happen.
For a
Final word?
future ICE study.
Yes. So that is a great place for us to end. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank ICE for bringing us together today. Thanks everyone for coming. So we now have an opportunity and some time for an informal discussion and networking. So please stick around and we can continue the conversation. Thanks everyone.